we're so often told in the scriptures not to be afraid. And yet in our lives, fear is part of our lives. And in our individual relationships with people with disability, fear can be a real obstacle. You see, there is the fear of not being able to cope with an unfamiliar problem. There's the fear of causing embarrassment. There's the fear of displaying your own inadequacies in your approach to the disabled person. There's fear of the unknown. And that God is urging us to trust him. That lovely quote, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you." So, with all the fears that we encounter in our lives, we can gain the strength that we need through our relationship with Christ, who has called us to a unique friendship with himself in love. If we cling to Christ in love, he will free us from our selfishness and enable us to embrace our brothers and sisters with their special needs. Our Lady is at our side to help us on the way, and the Lord is with her.
Thank you. I'm going to read you now something you wrote in the annual report. But the main point of my reading it to you is not only for what you said, but to remind you when you wrote it, which was in 1959. And what you wrote was, "No matter how badly disabled their bodies, these boys and girls are the same in character as you," and you were referring, of course, to the children we took at the time with disabilities. "They have immortal souls the same as everyone else. They have hopes no different from yours and mine, likes and dislikes of much the same kind as you and I have. In spite of the fact that they live in wheelchairs or can only get about slowly, or perhaps cannot see or hear or speak, there is really very little difference between them and you and I as people." Now, you wrote that almost 50 years ago, and what you wrote is happily recognized, I think, much more now, but I suspect the society's still got a lot to learn. But I just wondered, because at that time it was still rather the practice to be embarrassed about people with disabilities and to kind of shut them away, and yet you were already speaking in this kind of way and writing in that kind of way. What helped you to understand that was how to treat people with disabilities?
Well, that's not too difficult to answer that question, because if you actually work with disabled people, adults or children, then you get to know them and you get to know how their minds work and how they are as people. And so I had a great advantage because I was employed at that time in a school and hospital for disabled children up to the age of 18. And so that gave me a great advantage of understanding what made them tick and how they were as persons. In all our lives, as we grow up, so much time and effort are spent in our education, our professional training or particular training, and building up our self-confidence, and that is quite right and very necessary. But when it comes to the the spiritual life of having a relationship with Christ, a loving relationship with Christ, He has told us that we are so helpless. Without me, you can do nothing. And the realization of our dependence on God, our need for God, is something which in some ways is counter to all the time and effort and education and training that's been going on in our lives. And for us to, because of our own self-confidence, self-esteem that has been built up, for us to accept our need for God, to accept our, what some people would call our inner poverty, is not only difficult, but I believe impossible for unaided human nature to fully accept this. One needs God's help to see the reality of how we need God's help, how dependent we are on Him. And really, I believe that until that realization dawns, it's only then that we turn to Him, I would say turn to Him in earnest, to seek the help that He's eager to give us, but which we have regarded as something which we have to produce ourselves. It's if you like, it's a kind of echoing of the first beatitude. How happy are the poor in spirit? How happy are those who know their need for God? Because until they do know their need for God, then they tend to, understandably, depend on number one, themselves. And to know their need for God, then they'll be searching for God, that contact with God, throughout their day, throughout their lives, because they very much know they need His input, they need His help, they need His love, so that they can become channels, if you like, channels of His love to other people.
What would you say is the message of the apparitions in regard to people with disabilities?
I think that the answer to that question is given very well in a recent publication, a book by Father John Loughran, A Miracle to Lourdes. And one of his themes in the book is that Our Lady is not primarily concerned with physical cures and things like that. She's primarily concerned with leading us all back to a realization of God's love for us individually. And of course that can be tremendously important for someone with disability who may have got a chip on their shoulder that they're a sort of second-class citizen, that they are individually so important to God. This, if I might say so, this gospel insight by Father John Loughran, that this is Our Lady's main purpose in appearing in Lourdes to St. Bernadette, is to reawaken in all of us this realization that God loves us individually, that He cares for us individually, and that He wants us individually. He's looking, as our present Holy Father said in one of his letters, He is thirsty for the love of each one of us.